Namaskar and welcome to Budget 2020. In the run-up to budget, the union budget, which will be presented on the 1st of February, we will look in depth at a few important sectors and what the finance minister is likely to do to spur growth, investment and job creation. Today we're going to focus on the services sector, which provides almost two-thirds of India's GDP. In the next half an hour, we'll be discussing what services expects from the budget. But to take us through this discussion, we have with us in the studio Professor Dheeraj Sharma is the director at IIM Rohtak, and Deepshika Sikarwar is senior editor at the Economic Times. So before we go ahead, let's take a look at a brief look, in fact, at the services sector and its contribution to India's GDP.
The services sector employs around 31% of the workforce and contributes about 60% of the country's GDP. This has made the sector attractive to foreign investors and has pushed Brand India into global markets. Trade, hotels, restaurants, transport, IT data and communication, financing, insurance, real estate, business services, community, social and personal services, and services associated with construction all come under the category of services. It is a key driver of India's economic growth, growing at around 7%. Net services export from April to November 2019 was estimated at US $142 billion, while imports being around US $89 billion. So why are services important? Services are the largest recipient of FDI in India. Travel and tourism have grown exponentially, and medical tourism will exceed US $9 billion by 2020. Mergers and acquisitions in healthcare are driving growth into new markets. The traffic into major ports of the country have grown more than 5 times between 2014 and 2018. There has been a 6-fold increase in government spending on telecom infrastructure. The Statue of Unity had generated Rs 82.51 crore revenue by November 2019. Indian IT firms continue to generate over $160 billion annually. Indian facilities management market has been growing at around 17% compound annual growth rate, supported by real estate, retail and hospitality sectors. Healthcare is expected to reach US $132 billion by 2023. India's digital economy itself will be over US $1 trillion by 2025. GST input credit has brought prices of services down and made them more competitive. Clearly, the services sector is providing the thrust for speedy growth. The thrust that will help the economy accelerate to achieve the goal of a $5 trillion economy. Budget Desk, DD India.
So Professor Dheeraj Sharma, the goal is $5 trillion and the target really is that services will contribute at least $3 trillion of that, and it has to provide the momentum for that kind of leap forward. Where do you think it's going to come from? Which services?
I think the momentum has already started. If you would notice the indices in the month of November and December, there's been a significant spur in the services sector primarily. But the expected growth, I believe, should come from IT as always.
Right.
Additionally, I think one can expect some inputs in the real estate sector, which really needs to spur. I think on-demand services is another area. It's growing, and I think but the important thing here is one cannot isolate services alone. You see, that would be the biggest mistake that one could make, is that this is coupled. There is a link and this is a value chain. You cannot have services
Link
contributing.
with manufacturing is what you're saying?
Manufacturing,
and
infrastructure, agriculture, these are linked. And if you view them in isolation, it will not necessarily result in the kind of outcomes that we desire. So for us to have a $5 trillion economy, I think this linking is very important. So while services sector will continue to contribute from IT, from real estate, from on-demand services, telecom, however, there has to be linkage with healthcare, education, agriculture, and then infrastructure to support it, because at the end of the day, people are going to be living in these places and working in these places.
So Ms. Sikarwar, let's take a look at what some of the banking sector or companies that give out small loans for vehicles, for instance. They would hope to see that the budget does something that will spur, let's say, demand for automobiles. So there is a linkage, isn't it, in that sort of way? How would you think, could you explain that linkage actually between, let's say, manufacturing and some of the services?
So, right now, one of the key issues that confronts our economy is liquidity. There is a credit freeze. So, banks are not lending that much. NBFCs actually were supplementing the lending of banks, especially to the consumer retail segment. That is not happening. We've seen what has happened in the NBFC sector in the past.
Yes.
So there is definitely an issue of credit there, and that has impacted demand. So retail buyers are not able, they don't have access to easy credit now.
Right.
So the easy finance is not available. So obviously they're not buying that many products, and that's reflecting on the demand side. So there is a clear linkage there, and I do hope that the budget sort of addresses this huge issue of the credit freeze which is there before us. Government really needs to get credit moving, whether it is bank lending or NBFC lending, the other segments of the whole area. So some sort of a scheme and there's been a lot of talk about, US had a TARP like scheme. So there has been a lot of talk about, in the run-up to the budget, that government may sort of come out with some sort of a scheme to ease liquidity for the sector.
Okay. Right. So that's important. Credit is extremely important because that's going to actually boost investment and make demand pick up. But if we look at travel and tourism, for instance, that's a sector which is moving, which India has tremendous potential, considering the value of the kind of monuments and the quality of our heritage. This is definitely undertapped, and now that we are moving into the digital age, it's easy to book tickets, it's easy to book accommodation. People should be traveling much more. What do you think really needs to be done to spur it?
I think if I were to give you some numbers, you would understand how big an opportunity this is. It is approximately the #1 country in terms of receipts of tourism is the United States.
Right.
And United States gets about $240 billion in tourism receipts every single year. India gets $28 billion. That's nearly about 1/10 of what the US does. Now, there's a long way. I think our focus has to not just be about the foreign tourists coming and spending dollar or pound or euro here, but also I think the domestic tourism has to be spurred, and I think some schemes have been initiated in recent times which can spur that. Additionally, the Udan scheme, which allows for connectivity between smaller towns, tier 2 towns, I think that is another area which one could use to spur the tourism sector. But imagine if we were to just move at a 12% in tourism, one should see in 5 years we go from about $28-30 billion to something like $60-70 billion just coming from tourism.
Yes.
And this is really possible. Amendments to the LTC policy, in CSR. Imagine CSR Act, if there could be some amendment where people could spend mandatory CSR on monuments or archaeological sites or so forth within the vicinity of where they are located, I think it would be advantageous to spur tourism.
Right.
I think it's again a combination of the tourism, railways, airways coming together and then leveraging on the infrastructure. I think it's a great way forward. I think we've got a lot of potential
Now,
there.
talking about that infrastructure, aviation is the quickest way for people to travel, and that's a sector where the margins are very low, Mr. Karwar. So, they've been asking, rationalize ATF taxes, take the sector out of debts. Is the government, do you think, does it have room to do something like that?
So, on ATF particularly, there has been consistent demand from the aviation sector that it should be brought under GST. But as we know, for states particularly, ATF tax on ATF constitutes a large chunk of revenues. So it doesn't seem like really possible in the budget that the center can do, because this is not within center's sort of ambit. It'll largely rest with the GST Council. Whether it can actually get states to sort of agree, I think with revenues of in GST under pressure because of the slowdown, I don't think it is happening anytime soon, because states also want to protect their revenues. So I don't think this demand of the airline sector sort of budget will be able to meet. Sorry to disappoint here.
Well, I don't know. Well, the aviation sector has asked for it because they believe that they're making the sector is full of debts, and they work on wafer thin margins, and they really want to do better. And I think it's probably a need of the
I understand where they're coming from, because obviously the operational costs are quite high for airline industry, and ATF, you know, is a substantial contributor to that. It will really help them, but I think the road is still very long to reach there.
What do you think about the other sectors of transportation that you did mention? How do you think they can be harnessed to produce to improve travel and tourism particularly?
I think aside from travel and tourism, I think many years ago, you know, a route from Delhi to Mumbai used to take about 6 or 7 days in a truck. Now it takes about 3.5 days for the cargo. We've done better, but we could still do better, and still do better is multimodal. I think we really need to, from a logistics standpoint, I think multimodal is the way forward, which means the combination of rail, road and sea and river. I think that linking, if that scheme has to be taken up, I hope that there is some budgetary allocation for promotion of this multimodal transportation, because if you really get into, no matter what you do, steel on water still continues to have the lowest carbon impact, and it's the cheapest way to move goods. So therefore, if you link the waterways and you have a really large project, it's also showcasing, it's like the Golden Quadrilateral did to India in 1990s. I think this linking of for logistical purposes purely will create a lot of synergy between various modes of transportation, will result in efficiencies, and I believe which will be passed on to the customer, spur growth. On the real estate sector, I think, which is very important, I think government really needs to seriously look at some last mile financing. We've talked about this before. There are a large number of projects, particularly in the real estate sector, which are about 90% complete. Now it's a chicken and egg situation. If they don't get finance for the 10%, they will not be able to finish. If they don't finish, customers won't take them. So I think that some sort of a scheme which allows the government or some NBFCs or some banks or some financial institution, state or central financial institution, to put in some money and then maybe garnish them along the way when they are collecting it from the customers is probably the way forward to spur growth in the real estate sector.
If I could just add on the real estate. So we know that a real estate fund has been set up by the government.
25,000 crores.
Yes, 25,000 crore with SBI Caps is managing.
And it's finishing about 1,600 projects.
Yes, so they already have started sort of, you know, moving around. They have a lot of applications from real estate projects. So that last mile, you know, funding, which because of which some of these projects have been stuck, that's getting taken care of.
I think and the rates were also very high. Are they coming down? I mean, the Prime Minister is talking about affordable housing by 2022. Yes, is that, you feel that the rates are coming down?
I think the rates should come down, and I think there has to also be, you know, more, I would say, lending opportunities for the banks to maintain with the NBFCs also. Rates have to come down. Otherwise, we fear stagflation. You see, we'll have increased inflation, we'll have slow growth. It's a complicated situation. But I think rates should come down. But I think overall the business environment, there has to be some agency which can really reinforce the faith. So let me give you an illustration here. Let's just take NHAI, the National Highway Authority of India. If one were to just look at it, it would have at least close to 100,000, which means 1 lakh crores worth of arbitration. Now, these are conflicts.
That's right.
I think an agency or some dedicated resources for resolution of these conflicts, and then possibly creating a superior climate as a result of that.
Dispute resolution is also a form of services in any case. Yes. So that actually contributes to service.
So arbitration services expedited or one-time settlements, because these will result in completion of projects and settlement of disputes.
Let's look at the sector that's really driving services, which is IT and IT-enabled services. and they contribute about 5.6% of GDP. And constantly we are seeing over $160 billion every year. And apparently, I think according to figures, $136 billion in exports from IT services. So this is really the sector that can take India, give India the global brand that we are hoping, the new India brand in a sense. Anything expected for the sector, Ms. Sikawar?
So see, actually, if you see, just as the the overall economic situation is, services sector, which used to be which is seen as a bellwether of the Indian economy, contributes substantially. It is expected to grow by 6.9, and if you look at past year's growth, we are consistently sort of coming down. So while we have taken measures, like corporate tax reductions for the manufacturing sector, now the numbers say that something needs to be done for the services sector as a whole. One of the key issues which the most services industries are facing is, the GST. The compliance under GST for the services sector have gone up. They need to register with each state under GST. So that is a huge cost for these services industry. IT,
systemic issue.
Systemic issues. And also in the IT and ITES sector, we were, catering to a segment, where the margins are very low, and we've seen that, new countries have come up which are giving us huge competition. So some sort of, smooth tax refund scheme for this sector, which will neutralize their taxation, because there have been some issues in the past, where the sectors faced huge delays in tax refunds and so on.
Okay.
And they've really got impacted under the GST. So I hope that some sort of incentive could sort of flow into from the budget this year.
So, Professor Sharma, it is GST in the end that will actually give a boost to the services sector, but that is not something that the budget deals with. It's at the GST Council level. So how do you think, services, it can only be from the direct tax point of view and from the expenditure point of view from the budget that we can look forward to. Given those two heads, how do you see, what can we expect?
I think it's likely that the income tax slab will be moved. I think that there has to be some tax break so people have some money to spend, and that can probably spur the demand. Reduction in interest, I think, rate is another one. I think people who have locked up their valuable savings in real estate projects, once they're locked up, locked out, I think that'll unfreeze a lot of assets, and there'll be movement of inventory. I think more importantly, there has to be agencies which directly deal with settlement of disputes, private public partnership. It's not just about partnership. It's about, for instance, there used to be this hybrid annuity model on which a lot of road infrastructure got built, where government became a partner. So in order for government to reinforce confidence in the infrastructure projects and their timely completion, I believe the budget will have to allocate funds where government will participate and partner and will allocate funds, not just leave it to the private sector. I think that's probably one of the ways in which one could spur. So if I were to repeat, I think it's the tax break, first of all, reduction in interest. I believe the third one is the one-time settlement scheme of the unfreezing of the assets, and the fourth one is what I just mentioned to you.
Sure. So let's look at the startup ecosystem as well, because a lot of them will be entering into the services space. It's the easiest way to enter into the market. You can make good profits, and we're looking at trying to get good growth into services. What do you think? Can some sort of incentives, right, for at the level of ideas itself, because at the end of the day, we're looking for local solutions to our problems, which are local in nature. Climate change affecting our own country. We don't have to look for the Googles of the world. Not those kind of solutions. Something local.
So if you actually see, a lot has been done on the startup side. Government launched a special program called Startup India.
Yes.
There were tax breaks given to effective ideas coming forward. There was some other funding easy funding
Right.
which was provided under all that. So a lot of things have been done in that space, and one thing which I wanted to highlight here is, you know, our IT sector, it really grew very well in the country, and it was said that it grew because government kept away from it. It did not have government's intervention. So when it comes to startup ecosystem, I think the government needs to do exactly that, you know, sort of just let it grow, foster it like that.
Okay.
It's provided the ecosystem. It's I think on the taxation side probably it could address some of the issues which startups typically face, you know,
Right.
like ESOP taxation and
Yes.
so on.
There's
So
always the feeling that there's needing
largely
venture
sort
capital
of
coming
provide
in.
a facilitative environment, a facilitative framework just put in place, and just let them grow.
Fair enough. So the government is providing a certain amount of facilitation. There's a good ecosystem. Professor Dheeraj Sharma, you know, overall in services, in fact, according to the World Travel and Tourism Council, that's the sector that's contributing the most. It says 9.2% of India's GDP is from there. Yes. And that's the sector that has plenty of headroom as well. And so does IT and IT-enabled services still. So are these the sectors that we should be pushing at, or looking at something new?
I think
because they're well established also.
I mean, it's easier to grow in these sectors.
Yeah.
Particularly with China reaching a particular plateauing sort of a situation, we have an advantage there. I think linking it with manufacturing again. For instance, why we are still struggling to have Apple manufacture its phones in India.
Right.
I mean, it's an opportunity for us, and I think it is linked with all these devices are then linked with services.
Okay, fair enough.
I think electronic manufacturing is probably related to that.
Yes.
But you mentioned travel and tourism. I think there is a significant amount of opportunity there. Government has taken steps about privatization of trains. They've already done some of that.
Yes.
More in that direction, and encouraging people, because it's an experience economy.
Yes. Yes.
People in this generation are probably not investing in the hard assets like buying a car.
Okay.
It's buying a vacation, which is now something which is important for the new
Fair enough,
generation.
fair
So
enough.
therefore, I think
Yes.
we have a lot of room there.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Professor Dheeraj Sharma and Deepshika Sikarwar, for joining us in the studio. Now, the World Travel and Tourism Council, as I said earlier, had calculated that tourism generated 16.91 lakh crore rupees. That's 9.2% of India's GDP in 2018. It also employed about 43 million people, which is 8.1% of the country's employment. Now, despite India's strength in both IT and tourism, there is plenty of headroom for growth. A working group on $5 trillion economy has pegged agriculture and manufacturing to contribute $1 trillion each, and the services sector will provide the rest. That's $3 trillion. Thanks very much for watching. Namaskar.